Welcome back. It's good to see everyone again. If I could see you, which obviously I can't. I hope you're out there. But today is a special presentation. There you go. A special presentation. I'm sure you remember that back from the 70s and 80s when I think it was CBS had a special presentation. That's what this is, because it's all over the news. Everywhere you look, everyone's talking about gerrymandering, right? And I know you want to know, who the heck is this Gerry guy and why is he doing all this mandering? Well, I'm going to tell you exactly why all this is going on and what the origin of this is. Because gerrymandering is almost, as you can say, as an American as apple pie. So to speak. Now, whether you like it or not, that's neither here nor there. We're not going to talk a lot of politics on this show. But what I do want to give you is a little bit of the beginnings, the origin. How did this start? How did it get its name? Who's it named after? Well, we're going to get into all that in this episode of Retro Recon. That's the working title of this podcast. If you've been keeping up with that, you know that that's what I'm calling it, at least so far. But let's get into it. Let's talk about a guy named Elbridge Gerry. Now, you may or may not have heard of old Elbridge Gerry. He's a pretty important guy in the history of this country, the United States. He's been around. He's in your history books. You may have heard of him. You may not, but I'm going to talk about him today. Now, he was the 5th Vice President of the United States, right? The 5th Vice President. This is a big deal. The Vice President is important, right? Now, he was Vice President to James Madison, the father of the U.S. Constitution. Big deal there. You'll see that's kind of ironic when we talk a little bit later about some of the things that Gerry did during his career. But all right, so he's the 5th Vice President of the United States. He's also the 8th Governor of Massachusetts. So he has a, pretty good history in politics as an elected official. Now, Gerry was around for the American Revolution. He was active in protesting the British colonial movements. So he's been there from the jump, from the very, very beginning. He signed the Declaration of Independence. Right? Yeah, that's a pretty big deal. He's a signer of the Declaration of Independence, Elbridge Gerry. He also signed the Articles of Confederation, that famous Articles of Confederation that was so successful that it was replaced by the U.S. Constitution. Now, Elbridge Gerry did not sign the U.S. Constitution. He did not sign off on it. He was one of 3 people that attended the Constitutional Convention in 1787 that did not sign off on it. One of 3. Now, what he believed and what the anti-federalists in general believed was that the Constitution needed a Bill of Rights. Now, they were trying to push it through without the Bill of Rights. That was sort of an implied thing. Madison talked about how it was sort of an implied thing that, these rights and different things. However, a lot of people stood up and said, hold on, we need these Bill of Rights, and they did. And after the Constitutional Convention, Gerry was elected to Congress, and he actually helped push through some of the ideas for the Bill of Rights that James Madison wrote. The Bill of Rights, pretty big deal that we get those, and that's why I can actually say pretty much whatever I want to say on this podcast because, Elbridge Gerry stuck to his guns, right? So to speak, kind of, sort of, in a roundabout way. But anyway, he has a pretty successful history. Now, he was involved in a lot of different things, and we're going to get into that. But one of the things that you may or may not know, if you've ever heard of the XYZ Affair. Anyone ever heard of that? Bueller. I know some of you may have read this, and if you just recently took U.S. history, surely they went over the XYZ Affair. It's a big deal, right? Well, all right, so here is the XYZ Affair in a nutshell, really quick overview. Well, the United States, of course, had fought England to get their independence, right? Now, so then there comes a time where you have this moment. It's called, let me just get into the treaty. It's called Jay's Treaty. So what the United States does is they go into a treaty with Great Britain. Once again, they kind of, the people they just fought to get away from, they're kind of getting back with, sort of in a roundabout way, you could say. So this, in a nutshell, it ticks off the French. The French aren't really happy with all this stuff. So the French are angry with the United States. They think they're cozying up with the English, which, you can kind of make an argument that that could have been part of it. But long story short, the French are angry. John Adams is going to be president during this time frame that this kind of stuff happened. Well, John Adams was vice president when Jay's Treaty was passed. And actually, it was so contentious that Adams, as vice president, had to cast the deciding vote, which, of course, hung over Adams' head a little bit later on. Anyway, when it finally comes to a head where you have issues with France, it was going to be around the time that Adams is president. He's the second president of the United States after Washington, right? Okay, so Adams decides, hey, all right, let's send some people over to talk to the French and see if we can't, make them happy, cut a deal, do something. So he does. He sends 3 people to France, and they're people that you may have heard of. One of them is good old Elbridge Gerry, the guy we're talking about today. He's kind of the leader of the thing. Adams basically said there are 2 people in this country that are of impeccable character, and the other one is Elbridge Gerry. And he was talking about himself. So Adams and Elbridge Gerry, according to Adams, were the 2 people with impeccable character. So he sends Gerry to France, along with the perennial presidential candidate who loses a few times, Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, right? He's going to go. And also you got John Marshall is the third guy who goes. He's going to be a Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, pretty famous one, later on. So these are the 3 guys. They go to France. They hook up with a guy named Talleyrand. Now, Talleyrand, if you don't know about good old Talleyrand, I'm not going to go through his whole name because French people have these really long names. Normally, it's more, that's why we just call them by the one, like, Napoleon or Talleyrand or something like that. Anyway, Lafayette. Anyway, so Talleyrand is this kind of guy who gets stuff done. He's the guy, right? He does some things. He did quite a few things. In different treaties, he moves seats to try to get to the front. I mean, this guy's slick, right? I mean, he literally will change seats with people and try to move seats to get to the front and have a front and center presence in anything that he does. So now, in this particular case, the French are they're a little full of themselves. Let's just say what it is. They're a little, maybe they go into business for themselves a little bit. And Talleyrand and 3 other people who are labeled as X, Y, and Z because they didn't want to release their names, the French envoy. They didn't want to release their names. You can find them. They're on Google. I'm not going to go into it today because, again, they're very long names, and I don't know if it would mean anything to you or not. But anyway, so they refer to them as X, Y, and Z. They basically asked the American envoy that's coming over, y'all need to pay us. We want kind of like tribute, a loan, a bribe, whatever you want to call it. You need to pay us for us to sit down and talk to you. We're just not going to do it because in the idea of France, the Americans aren't that important, really, right? So they get into this, and of course, Gerry is no way. He's an impeccable character kind of guy. No way I'm doing this. I'm not going to, So he sends Marshall and Pinckney home, and he stays, right? He stays. They never can come to a deal. Of course, they're not going to pay any kind of bribe or anything to the French. This turns into an international incident, and basically, it turns into what's referred to as the quasi-war with France, right? So the quasi-war with France is there's some skirmishes on the water, here and there, but it's not really like a war like you would think. I mean, there's not like, the French don't invade the United States or anything like that. But there is a moment or two during Adams' presidency where people think that we're heading in that direction, right? And some people are very, very upset. Now, Adams had a relatively successful presidency up to that point. up to the XYZ affair. Now you have this quasi war with France, and all this stuff is going kind of, backwards on him. He also puts out the Alien and Sedition Acts. That was recently in the news as well, the alien part of it. The Alien and Sedition Acts are, they come in, they're very unpopular. People don't like them. And there actually are, basically what it says is you can't say anything bad about the president. And then of course with immigration part of it as well, which we won't get too far into that, but they actually do jail some journalists under this act. So it's something that they actually enforce. This makes Adams less popular. Now, also, they're thinking they're going to war. So what are we going to do? We need a general to head this thing up. And the guy who steps up, Alexander Hamilton. His name is Alexander Hamilton. There's a million things I haven't done. Just you wait. You know the guy. Alexander Hamilton steps up and says, I'll do it. And George Washington, who is at home at Mount Vernon, says, yeah, let Hamilton do it. Adams hates Hamilton. Absolutely hates Hamilton. He refers to him as a bastard brat of a Scottish peddler. That's how much he hates Alexander Hamilton. And the feeling is mutual. Hamilton is not a really big fan of Adams either, to be quite honest. Now, Hamilton wants the job as like the head general in charge of the American military. He wants the job. Washington is like okay with it, because he still wields a lot of influence. Adams is not even close. So what Adams does is try to call Washington back, and Washington is actually going to come back and head up the military. If we would have, let's say, you can't change history, but if we would have went to war with France in like an actual war kind of thing, then, Washington would have been the guy. Because he was willing to come back and have Hamilton right there by his side, right? Because, ride together one more time. So anyway, this turns into a mess politically, right? Because you have Hamilton who absolutely hates Adams. In fact, he says that Adams doesn't even have the character to be president of the United States. And he starts to refer to him as his Lord Rotundity, as does everybody else, because Adams was a little, let's say, on the rotund, a robust kind of guy, So anyway, so that he started referring to him as his Lord Rotundity. His presidency is going, down the drain. The quasi-war is rocking on. And all these different things. And Hamilton actually writes this letter talking about the character of John Adams and just talking terrible about him. So Adams is in a lot of trouble. He is, this is not looking good for Adams. And of course, there's a guy named Thomas Jefferson that's waiting in the wings and can't wait to get in there. And Jefferson is just waiting to be president of the United States. So he's right there. And, if you know anything about the election of 1800, you know that John Adams, as they say in the Hamilton music, he shat the bed, which he kind of did with some of his policies. Now, again, with the thing with France, I can't really put that 100% on Adams, the stuff that went on with France. And he actually, I guess, unfortunately for Adams, after the votes had come in and after Jefferson and Burr they tied, Jefferson and Aaron Burr tied, and then you get into all that mess, which turns into a whole other thing. After the election was over, the French, they found out that Adams had negotiated a treaty with the French, and it all ended. So, the thing that started his downfall, actually, it's unfortunate, but Adams only serves the one term, as everyone knows. Then you have the tie between Jefferson and Burr. And of course, Hamilton pops up again because Hamilton actually gears support toward Jefferson, which is extremely ironic because those two guys don't get along. But he hates Burr worse, and everybody knows what happens with the duel. Maybe I'll do a whole episode on the duel later because it's a little bit more interesting than you would think. The things that went on leading up to it. But so Adams and his administration are kind of in a mess. Elbridge Gerry is kind of blamed for a lot of the things that went on in the XYZ affair. So he is kind of on the outs, and no one really knows what his future holds and different things. So a lot of people are upset with him because they think that because he sent Marshall and Pinckney home, that it was his fault that all this went on. But really, I don't know that he could have done anything differently, truth be told. All right, so now let's get to the main crux of the deal. What is this gerrymandering stuff? And because I've been leading up to this, because I think you figured out when I said Elbridge Gerry and was talking about gerrymandering that this was going to end up here, and here it is. All right, so Elbridge Gerry, as I mentioned earlier, was the 8th governor of the great state of Massachusetts, long before the Boston Red Sox. Although, if you're from Massachusetts, I'm sure you're a Red Sox fan, right? So there you go. So he was the governor. So what they decide to do while he is governor is they start thinking, we can redesign these districts here. We can do this, can't we? We can change this up. I mean, there's nothing saying that we can't. It'll have our supporters and different things in this area, so it'll be beneficial for us to do this. So Elbridge Gerry is the first guy to try this. So Gerry says, "Hold on a minute. Let me redesign this whole thing." So as he redesigns the district that he's the different things that he's in, right? He there's a map that comes out. You can find this online too. There's a picture, and some people start referring to this picture as a salamander. It looks like, because it's so out of, most of the time, if you have lines of things, they're in a little sort of a square-ish shape. Maybe it makes sense that they are connected. However, Gerry's new district that he did in Massachusetts was like crazy shaped and looked like a salamander, right? So that's the thing. They started referring to it as the salamander. This was Elbridge Gerry's salamander. It worked. He put it together. And then, of course, what happens and what they start to refer to this thing as, because of the salamander shape of the new district, and of course, you have Elbridge Gerry's name, Gerry, you put together Gerry and salamander, what do you get? Gerry Salamander. No, you get gerrymandering. Thus, there you go. That's why it's called gerrymandering. So today, when you hear the term gerrymandering, that's where it comes from. That's the origin of the term. You have Elbridge Gerry, who at the time, I should mention, that you can't really, the thing about, if you want to get into, the politics of this thing, the thing about comparing political parties, you can't really do that from way back, because they're not that you have different issues. It is it's one of those things that you just can't really do, because there's different things happening way back in Elbridge Gerry's time than there is now. So you can't really say this party resembles this party or that party. It's hard to do. But just for to be thorough here, the parties at the time, at least leading up to this, you had the Federalist Party, which was, the party of, basically you could sort of say Washington and Adams, right? Hamilton, you could say that. And then you have the Democratic Republican Party, because you get a two-party system a little bit later with Thomas Jefferson, right? Even Aaron Burr, he's on that side too. James Madison. You get this whole shift, and you get a two-party system, and they come up with the Democratic Republican Party. So then you have the Federalist Party and the Democratic Republican Party. Now, Gerry, which should be, I guess, it makes sense when you look at gerrymandering, I guess, the whole idea, he shifts, and a lot of people do, they shift different, you see that a lot, people go into business for themselves or see an opportunity here, and the political party doesn't mean as much, right? So that's the idea, I guess. So what happens is Gerry kind of starts out sort of as a Federalist after the Constitution, because his disagreement with pushing the Constitution through without a Bill of Rights puts him puts him in opposition to the Federalists, right? However, he does kind of come back. He works with Adams. He becomes a Federalist, but then after the whole XYZ affair, he's kind of persona non grata. So he's like, well, I'll the heck with you. So when he is governor of Massachusetts, he's a Democratic Republican. That's what they refer to themselves as, Democratic Republicans. So, what does that mean for today? Nothing. Not really. I mean, you can look at different ideas, because the two parties that we have today, you have the Democratic Party. This is the Democratic Party, which was originally founded by Martin Van Buren and Andrew Jackson. That's kind of the Democratic Party. And then the Republican Party was an anti-slavery party that came out. And of course, we know the first Republican was Abraham Lincoln. That was in the 1850s. So those are the two parties that exist today. Now, they went through major changes over the years, so you can't really say one resembles the other at any, particular, time. And you had a lot of other ones that popped up in there. The Whigs, the Know Nothings. You have all these different things that will pop up here and there. You had that Dixiecrat movement, which is, I don't want to get into that. But anyway, so it's hard to, like, if you were to say Elbridge Gerry did this because of some belief that is relevant today, it's not really there. So that is anachronistic, as historians say. But if you were curious about where gerrymandering come from, there you go. That's the answer. Gerrymandering came from Elbridge Gerry and a salamander and Massachusetts. There you go. So that's it. That's where gerrymandering came from. And you also have, over the years, you can get into, when it was used, when it was, it's been something people have tried to do forever. So it's still around. So there you go. That is the origin of gerrymandering. I hope that if you didn't already know this, at least maybe you learned something today or found some of this interesting. But that was our special presentation today on the origin of gerrymandering. So I hope that everyone has a gerrymandering good day.